Please welcome to the stage Matthew Swift, co-founder, president, and CEO Concordia, and Honorable Donald Rumsfeld, President Rumsfeld Foundation, 13th and 21st U.S. Secretary of Defense.
Greetings. Mr. Secretary, good afternoon.
That's Henry Kissinger.
That is. Who else is in the picture?
That's Gerald Ford.
Who's on the far left?
That's Nelson Rockefeller. That's Jack Marsh, I'm almost certain. I don't recognize that young man.
Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for coming to Concordia and joining us today. One of the reasons why I'm particularly excited to have you is because your career is representative of a remarkable history between both the public and private sectors. And so I'm excited to talk to you about both your public sector career and your private sector career.
I had a daughter in college. She came home one day and she said, "Dad, we're studying you in school." I said, "I didn't know you were taking history and taking current events." And she said, "No, I'm taking history." Talk about putting you down.
So I think about you often, and one of the reasons is because in my office I have a memo on my wall that's really designed to remind me that when I feel overwhelmed, I shouldn't be overwhelmed because I haven't been in the kinds of positions that you're in. But you wrote a memo to Doug Feith, who was a Undersecretary of Defense for Policy for you under the Bush administration. And the subject line, and you're famous for your memos, the subject line, "Issues with various countries. We need more coercive diplomacy with respect to Syria and Libya, and we need it fast. If they mess up Iraq, it will delay bringing our troops home. We also need to solve the Pakistan problem, and Korea doesn't seem to be going well at all. Are you coming up with proposals for me to send around?" You're rather direct. You're tough to work for.
That doesn't sound like me.
No?
I'm generally sweet and lovable, and I never use three-syllable words.
There we go. Now, you have worked for a number of presidents in your career. 7?
I don't know. I don't count anymore. My first vote was for Eisenhower.
All right.
I was born when Herbert Hoover was president, but I never worked with him.
Okay, okay. What quality, in one word, do you admire? I'm going to name a couple presidents, and I want to know, in one word, how you would describe them. President Ford.
Integrity.
Nixon.
Strategic.
Reagan.
Warm.
George W. Bush.
Courage.
Let's start with your foundation. We've partnered with you with a programming partnership with the Rumsfeld Foundation. You started it in 2007 with your wife, Joyce, right? Part of your foundation's mission is to encourage and reward leadership in public service, but why was public service a core part of the foundation that you've started with your wife?
Well, my father served in the Navy in World War II, and I studied history, and I spent a lot of time thinking about public service. And so I worry that government is criticized, often fairly, but sometimes unfairly. And it seemed to me that I didn't want young people to be discouraged about entering public service. And so we decided to create a foundation where we ended up with a focus on the military charities that are doing things for military families. Each one of those individuals is a volunteer. They're not conscripted. They raise their hand and say, "Send me," and God bless them for it. We decided we wanted to encourage graduate fellows and people who were in need. I had 2 people working with me in the Pentagon, both PhDs, Dr. Steve Cambone and Dr. J.D. Crouch. J.D.'s now head of the USO. But they both needed assistance to get a master's degree and then a PhD. And they served the country really well. And I knew that there was a foundation that had been providing assistance to people in need for working on their masters who were interested in public service, and that they were phasing down. and I decided that we ought to step in and fill that gap if we could. And so we ended up with, today I think we've had close to 100 that we've assisted with their financial side of getting their, in fact, we have a big conference of all of them and the sponsors from the colleges and universities that send us recommendations as to who we should assist. So that's been something that we've been doing and enjoying being able to do. I've been fortunate. I spent 20 years of my life in business out of government, which enables us to be able to be of assistance on things like that. We also have a graduate, well, not really graduate, but it's Greater Central Asia. It's the 5 Caucasus countries, the 3 Caucasus countries, the 5 Central Asian countries, plus Afghanistan and Mongolia. And we bring people in between the ages of 29 and 40 who are fast risers. They're kind of like in the United States, we have a White House Fellow program where people are very carefully selected and they work in government. And these people come from these 10 countries in that important part of the world, buried right between Russia and China. And we've had, I think, 160 that we've brought over now. And some are in government, some are in the military, some are in business, a number in NGOs and academic world. And they've become a network. There is no network among those countries. They tend not to visit each other, but an awful lot of them are active in their societies in one way or another, in the public side or in the private side for profit. Many are in the nonprofit element of their societies. And they've gotten to know each other, and they're reinforcing each other and assisting each other. In fact, we've got some of them here. I just visited with one from Mongolia who happened to be in town, and I've seen several others that you were kind enough to include here in the program. So it's been fun. We feel good about the foundation. It isn't easy to give money away and support organizations because the organizations change. And unlike private sector things that if they go bad, they end, nonprofits can go on because people remember them the way they were. And so you have to be pretty careful on military charities, for example, to see who's on the board, who's paying attention, and that they're in fact doing a good job, and not an organization that used to do a good job but is no longer doing a good job. So we pay a lot of attention to it, and we feel that for the most part, it's been helpful.
We've been talking a lot today, actually, about the refugee crisis, and I'd like to talk a little bit about Syria. Get your take on the situation there, U.S. policy toward Syria. What are your thoughts?
Well, there's folks here. I think Jim Woolsey's been around here, and I see John Negroponte's been here, and Madeleine Albright just walked in. There are folks that are very much engaged and current. I live out in New Mexico and Montana now, but I can say a few things about the situation there in Syria. It's very complicated. It isn't easy. It's tough. The administration's got its hands full trying to figure out how to be of assistance and to whom to provide assistance, and then to stay on top of it so that in fact you don't end up competing with yourselves. And our allies and friends around the world, and some people who assist who aren't really friends, have different interests. And so your interests may coincide for a period and then they may diverge. And I think that we're probably as a country getting better at the languages that need to be spoken, better at the understanding that countries are so different. They all have different histories, different cultures, different languages, different neighbors, different political situations. And diplomacy is tough. And people develop approaches that worked well one place and they seem not to work quite as well another place. So I'm not being fully briefed in. My instinct would be to be very careful about thinking that I could provide a better approach. I do have a lot of respect for people who serve in the State Department and in the Defense Department. and in the intelligence communities in the United States. They're well motivated, they're generally well trained. They're all human beings, and they can do things well, and sometimes things don't work out so quite so well. But the thing that worries me about, and I must say, I have a lot of respect, Matt, for what you've done here with Concordia, where you have recognized the differences between the public sector and the private sector, and the importance of taking the capacities, the capabilities, the talents, the skill sets from each and trying to find ways to marry them in ways that benefit each. I served in government for a lot of years, and I studied it in college. I worked for a congressman. I served in the Navy, and then I became a congressman, and then I ran some departments and agencies in the executive branch. And I'll be honest, I thought I understood the executive branch when I was in the legislative branch. And it turns out I did. I understood it intellectually and academically, but I didn't understand it emotionally or multidimensionally. And I ended up, when I left the Congress and went to the executive branch, I wrote a couple of letters of apologies to people in the executive branch who'd appeared before our committees.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, I felt I hadn't been fair to them. The same thing in business. When I was in government, I looked at business and I thought I understood business, and I did, intellectually. But I didn't understand it emotionally or multidimensionally. I had no idea how damaging government could be, not because it intended to be, but because it delayed, and the uncertainties that were injected into it, and how big companies that have lawyers and lobbyists and much greater staying power can survive all that. But the countries that really provide the jobs in the United States are the medium-sized and smaller countries. They're the entrepreneurial countries. That's where the ideas and the creativity come from. And a delay and uncertainty there kills them. They go out of business.
What was the most difficult thing about going from the public sector to the private sector for you?
It's a lot easier than going from the private sector to the public sector. In the public sector, you try and do something, and you put it in place. And unless you're a genius, and none of us are, or darn few are, you see that it isn't working, and you want to change it. And before you even get a chance to do that, there's congressional hearings, and there's press observations, and everyone's fussing about it, and they want to pull the plant up by the roots to see how it's growing. Well, that's not a healthy way to grow a plant. And in business, you can put something in place, leave it there long enough to see if it's working, change it if it isn't, calibrate it, adjust it, and fix it. And you're not under the microscope every 5 minutes, and the press isn't examining it, and the congressional hearings aren't going on, which alters everything in government. And so I think it's a much easier transition from government to business, as long as you respect private enterprise. You can't be hostile to it, but if you respect it and understand the value in the world in terms of providing jobs and products and opportunities for people, and the courage it takes for the investors and the risk takers to do what they do, to put money at stake and be patient enough to see 3 things fail for 1 thing that succeeded. But coming from business into government is a much more difficult experience because of the continuous external examination of everything you're doing. And people end up spending an awful lot more time thinking about that than thinking about trying to create something of value.
Do you, from a millennial perspective, I mean, we had a session yesterday on Europe, and there was a lot of negativity. We don't know what the future is. The future doesn't look good. Everything looks bleak. The sky is falling. We had a political panel yesterday with 4 senators. They all agreed it was the worst partisan political environment they've ever seen. That's
nonsense.
Yeah?
I wasn't here to listen, so I shouldn't say that. That's not nice. But it was a 2-syllable word instead of a 3-syllable word. But, I mean, I was in Washington during the Vietnam War and the civil rights demonstrations. Lyndon Johnson had to put revetments around the White House. They strung buses around. so that people couldn't break into the White House. The whole northeast section of Washington, D.C. was aflame. You couldn't get across a bridge unless you could prove you lived in Washington, D.C. It was Watts blew up. Detroit blew up. It was a terribly difficult time. The hostility and the anger and the venom, this is nothing compared to what you've seen then. Now, you should go back and read history and read what Jefferson said about people and one thing and another. And these folks, politics is you know, it's the NFL. It's tough. And a lot of people don't like it. And so a lot of sensitive, good people don't go into it. And you've got to have a pretty thick skin to do it. But I mean, when I was in Congress, I played paddleball down in the gym with Democrats, and I had as many friends who were Democrats as there were Republicans. And we all worked together to pass civil rights legislation in the Congress, Democrats and Republicans together. Today it's different, to be sure. Part of it's television.
Yeah.
People don't go to a committee hearing to learn anything. They go to a committee hearing, pop in, make a statement that they hope gets on television, race off and say, "Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, I've got to leave and go to the next meeting because I'm chairing a subcommittee on goodness knows what." And they drift off. But in those days, people didn't, you know, there wasn't as much air traffic, and people generally didn't go home every weekend, and you'd get to know their kids, and you'd get to know their wives, and you'd get to understand them and see their perspective. And you know, where you stand depends on where you sit. We all have different perspectives, different constituencies. And either you understand that, tolerate it, and expect it, and work with it, or you say, "Oh my goodness, henny pennies, the sky falling, this is all terrible." But what we're experiencing today in the United States of America, we're going to get through. But television, once they stuck television into those hearing rooms, and they stuck television into the chamber of the House of Representatives, and television everywhere, people have to spend, and I'm not being critical, but people do have to spend time thinking about that instead of the substance of what they were elected to do.
Sound bites. Everything's in sound bites.
Yep.
But something is different, it seems, today from maybe even a few years ago. You seem to have a lot of people who feel disconnected from the system, that they aren't, the American dream does not seem to be as alive and well as it might have been 30 years ago. What's happening?
Well, as I say, my first vote was for Eisenhower. And I thought the world of Adlai Stevenson, his opponent. He'd been governor of my home state. He'd spoken at my senior banquet in college, and he was a wonderful orator. And I figured out soon that we have two great political parties, and therefore they have to be big tents. You're going to have people disagreeing in each party. And they do, but when you get to know people and understand their perspective and their backgrounds and their experiences, you end up seeing that it's understandable that they're walking at something from a different direction. And it requires leadership, it requires persuasion, it requires understanding that people can be doing things for different reasons and come out on the same side. Because in the last analysis, what we do is we weigh. In this coming election, people say things in ways that I wouldn't say them, maybe. But I'm 84 years old, so I mean, I come from a different era. On the other hand, Trump and Sanders have touched a nerve in this country that people who aren't touching those nerves better think about. Because democracy can work, but it can only work if people understand what's going on and are willing to engage and participate and use their best judgment as to where they want to be supportive. And the other day I was talking to some businessmen, and they said, "Well, you used to be ambassador to NATO. What do you think about one of the candidates, what they said about NATO?" And they said, "Well, some of the countries aren't pulling their oar, They should be doing more. And it's an old institution, and it was fashioned in the post-World War II period. And he gets the nomination for president. And they said, what do you think about that? And I said, well, I'll tell you, the fact is, the United States is spending something in the neighborhood of less than 4% on GDP on defense, and our NATO allies are spending less than 2%, and some of them for the wrong reason. And they do need to invest more if we're going to be able, as an enormously successful military alliance, if we're going to be able to contribute to a more peaceful and stable world. And second, it's true, most of the institutions today were created in the post-World War II period, going into the Cold War, that inflection point. And that's a long time ago. We've come out of the Cold War period, and we're into the information age in the 21st century. And if you think about it, the CIA, the National Security Council, NATO, the UN, many of the financial institutions, all were created in that enormously creative period of the post-World War II period, with a lot of them with Harry Truman as President of the United States contributing, and Republicans and Democrats, Arthur Vandenberg and others were participating. It is time to look at some of those and maybe have another Hoover Commission and see if we can't make the kinds of adjustments that reflect the changes in the world that have taken place. And then I said to the businessman I was talking to, and I said, now, the candidate for president on the Republican side said it differently than I just said it. The way he said it, he got the nomination. The way I just said it, people's eyes glazed over. Now, that's what's going on. Those two people can draw 25 or 30,000 people to hear him speak. Now, social media contributes to that, to be sure. But they've touched a nerve. The people that are supported them, in the case of Sanders, and supporting Trump, are sending a message out there that people better listen to. Not that anyone's going to agree. I've never agreed with a person I've voted for 100% in my life, I don't reckon, and I don't expect that. But they have to listen and learn from what the candidates are saying and what the response is to what they're saying.
But you've endorsed Donald Trump, who has a very different foreign policy perspective from a lot of foreign policy decisions you played a critical role in determining.
I don't even agree with my wife on everything. I mean, if you have only two big parties, you're bound to have to say, well, which one, if you take the pluses and the minuses on each side and then weigh them, how do you come out? You got a choice. You don't vote. Well, that's a cop-out, and you're helping somebody you don't mean to help, probably. You don't even know who you're helping or hurting. And the same thing if you vote for a third party. They're not going anywhere.
But why have you
So you have to
supported
pick one of the two.
Yeah.
Because if you add up the pluses and the minuses on both sides and put a value on them, I come out with the nominee of the Republican Party that I personally think is closer to what I would hope. I think it's awfully hard for the nominee of the Democratic Party, who has such a challenge to be believed. It's hard. If we lead by consent, not command, in this country, and you can't gain consent and public support if you're not believed. And to be persuasive, you have to be believable. And I think she has a challenge in that regard. But my wife called me one day and said, I think I know how you should answer the question on the presidency. I said, what's that? She said, well, on the Democrat side, you've got a known known. On the Republican side, you've got a known unknown. I'm over here. But it's a free country. People can vote any way they want, and they will, and God bless them for it. I just hope they don't vote. I hope they do vote, don't not vote.
What issue do we not talk about enough? What do we not think about enough?
The things that aren't on television, the things that aren't noted in the nightly news. We read about North Koreans' nuclear program and their missile firings. We read about Iran and the Iranian deal, and people have strong views on both sides. And we read about Mr. Putin, his muscular activities in the Crimea. And we read about the Chinese taking a reef and making a major airport and seaport, moving in troops and missiles and airplanes and ships. We don't read a thing about, we read about Ferguson, or we read about Baltimore and the riots and those things, but we don't read anything about the parliamentarian in the Philippines who not only sees what the PRC is doing in the South China Sea, but sees what other countries in that part of the world, in Pacific nations, are not doing about that. We read about what's going on in Baltimore with the riots and the destruction of businesses and neighborhoods and the fear that it implants in people, and the lack of respect for the police and the lack of support for the police on the part of the government and officials in that town. But we don't read about the spouse of a policeman who goes down and says, hey, you've been doing this for 12 years, and you're not getting any support. And there are another 6 policemen killed in city A, B, or C across the country. Don't you think it's time for us to move to Phoenix and maybe you go into the corporate security business? There's actions that we read about, and they're newsworthy. We do not read about the absence of reactions to them or the reactions that are micro. And so if you say to yourself on a macro basis, what's big? Well, the ones I mentioned are big. Cyber warfare, the threat of terrorism, ISIS, North Korea, Iran, anything, what Putin's doing, what the PRC's doing. Those are big. And we all read about them and know about them, and we elevate them in our minds to problems. But by golly, I don't know if I'm right, but I could make a wild flying guess that what I just mentioned is more important than any one of those. And it's the micro effects that are taking place all across the globe. The legislator who casts a vote this way instead of that way. The spouse who says we should be doing this instead of that. You think of El-Sisi's speech in Egypt. He knows his predecessor Sadat was killed by the Muslim Brotherhood offshoot. He knows that if he stands up in the most important Arab city, Cairo, in the most important Arab country, Egypt, to the most important body of persuaders and leaders, a group of imams in the country, and he says to them, look, there's a struggle going on in our faith, and the ones that are radical jihadists are wrong. They're damaging us, they're killing Muslims, they're killing people from other faiths, and it's our responsibility to do something about that. Now, I'm sure he said it more in Egyptian, more eloquently than I did, but it was silence. Nobody in the world said a thing. If you're an imam in Indonesia and you agree with that, you say, gee, I think he's right. I think we got a problem. I think the jihadists are taking us in the wrong direction. We've got to do something about this. We've got to step up. And then he looks around, and no one's agreeing with El-Sisi. I bet you there aren't 5% of the people in the United States of America even know he made the speech, or that there's that kind of leadership within that faith. Yeah. And God bless him for doing it, and gutsy for doing it. He put a target on his forehead, and we didn't support it. We fuss about him providing, our government currently has been, at least the last time I looked, which was probably a number of weeks ago before I went back out to Montana and New Mexico, we weren't even supplying parts for some of the equipment we'd sold him because he's not a perfect Democrat. He isn't exactly like us. If you looked at the spectrum and said, this is bad and this is good, and then you say, well, how do you make those judgments? Well, what we really mean is this is more like us.
Yeah.
And this is less like us. And then you say, well, where is anybody on that spectrum? And if this is the lesser half and this is the better half, meaning more like us, the worst thing we can do is stick a stick in somebody's eye when they're moving in the right direction, what we think to be the right direction.
Yeah.
But I mean, you look at our country, we're a different country 50 years ago.
Yeah.
We're a different country 100 years ago, and we're going to be a different country as to what's right and what's wrong, or what's best and what's less good in another 50 years. And it seems to me that we have to have a tolerance that understands that nations around the world are different. And they need different kinds of governments at different times, just as we've had different kinds of governments and policies at different times. And we ought to be more interested in whether they seem to be moving in the direction that provides greater opportunity for more people, greater voice for more people, a better standard of living, things like clean water and electricity. And if they're going in that direction, that's probably pretty good. And the template we have is not something that we ought to press down on other countries, because it ought to be a model for others who want to follow it. And at different times in our history, our current template didn't fit us.
Yeah. You're an app developer now.
Oh, boy. Do I look like a techie?
Well, you have created an app called Churchill Solitaire. Let's show. We have a video that we're going to show.
Well, let me tell the background. You want me to tell the background?
Tell the background.
During World War II, Winston Churchill played solitaire, and he played this. And it's a game with 2 decks, very complicated, requires strategy, and it's a lot of fun. It's a superb game. And he taught it to a young Belgian diplomat when the Nazis took over in Belgium. The government in exile left to London, and André de Stark, this young diplomat, probably in his 20s or 30s, got to know Winston Churchill, and they became friends. And Churchill taught him this game. So 30 years later, 73 from 43, I end up as ambassador to NATO, and the young diplomat's now an old diplomat. He's the dean of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and his name was André de Stark, and he took me under his wing, and among other things, he taught me Churchill Solitaire. And it is a fabulous game and a challenge, and I can shamelessly promote it, because any money we make, we give to military charities here in the United States. So.
Well, let's watch the video.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender.
For decades, the game that Sir Winston Churchill played to sharpen his wits and steel his nerves was lost to the ages. Now, the most diabolical version of solitaire ever devised has been brought to life for a new generation. Churchill Solitaire will keep you coming back, battle after battle, deal after deal, until victory is won. Challenge your friends and family, compete against thousands worldwide, and using skill and cunning, advance through the ranks to become Prime Minister. Do you deserve victory? Play now for free in the App Store.
Never give in.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good.
It's fun. It's a lot of fun. It's a good game, and I had a lot of respect for André de Stark. He was a fine European leader for NATO.
So we have 63 countries represented at this summit this week. What do you want the audience to take away?
You know, I would almost reverse it. I think what we ought to do is learn from the 60 representatives from 63 other countries. You've got a lot of very prominent Americans here, and people who've done things and are doing things and are engaged. And we live in a big world, in a complicated world, and we need to learn from them, as well as thinking that they should take away something. And I hope that what they'll take away, I was in the Republic of Georgia not too many weeks ago, conference for our Central Asian Fellows Program, and one of the fellows from a different country asked one of the Georgian ministers, if you could give advice to the United States, president-elect, whoever that may be, what would you say? What would you tell that person? And the answer came back something to the effect, act like the United States, that a vacuum's been created, and nature abhors a vacuum, and it gets filled with ideas and activities and things that are different from our values or our interests, and that this minister said that she, it happened to be a she, said that she really believed that the world would be a better place if the United States would not allow that vacuum to be filled with people who are aggressive or behaving in a muscular or unpleasant way with other countries, and that leadership is important and governance is important. When I was in business, we had businesses in Venezuela, and it was a good country. They were doing things, and people were moving up a little bit. And right now, I saw videos the other day that are stunning, and I felt so badly. We had good managers running our business. There was good leadership, and now it's turmoil, and turmoil hurts everybody. It causes people to behave totally differently. I met one of the people here attending your conference. I was pleased he stopped, and we visited about migrations that are taking place in the country and his engagement now with the UN. And I thought, isn't that a good thing for the UN to be focused on? I mean, that's why the UN's there. It isn't a war-fighting organization. It's a representative organization, and if there's a problem in the world with refugees and migration problems, I mean, people do things for very rational reasons.
Yeah.
Some people will want to move, and they'll get in the queue to have legal entry in another country because they think they can do better and it's better for their families. And goodness knows this country of ours has benefited enormously from that kind of immigration. On the other hand, people don't want to immigrate. They want to stay where they are, and they can't because it's unsafe, and their families are at risk, and their children are at risk, and their businesses are at risk. And so they want to leave for a totally different reason. And I think that, I hope that, I'm a believer in a conference like this, and I must say I'm amazed at the success this has been for the people here, and in such a relatively short number of years. You've filled a vacuum that is needed to be filled, and that's a good thing. And I hope that the flow of information isn't one way, just takeaways from us, but that we'll take away something and have a greater respect for the diversity that is such a great asset for the world. The differences in history, the differences in culture, because there's no one smart enough to know exactly what it ought to be or how it ought to work in a certain place. And so I thank you for doing what you're doing, and I thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.